Now, we focused a lot on the navies of the US and China. What role does the Coast Guard of each
Mm.
country have to play in this?
Yeah, so this gray zone positional warfare that's been going on for the better part of the last 25 years. The Chinese want to try to set conditions, if they can, win without fighting. So if they can get everyone around them or even Taiwan to just acquiesce, that's victory. And the way they do that is they gradually apply pressure. They change the behaviors of fishermen, governments, either through graft and elite capture, or even just military pressure that's turned up very gradually through things like the maritime militia, which is repurposed fishing vessels with people that are part-time trained up to go out and do military naval type activities. And so the Coast Guards are kind of like the first backstop, kind of like the beat cop for the Chinese. They send in their thugs. When the thugs start getting a little bit too much pushback, the Coast Guard comes in and separates, but they always separate the two sides so that it's favorable to them. And this is what's been playing out in the South China Sea again for quite a while. Scarborough Shoal has been effectively under Chinese control since they reneged on a deal when they had a standoff in 2012 with the Filipinos. And so this is where the Coast Guard plays on the China side. And that's starting to change. They're starting to get an effective pushback because the Philippines, the Vietnamese, Malaysia to a lesser extent, but also Indonesia have started to invest more in their military, their naval, but also their coast guards. And the Philippines, most notably, are televising and exposing all of the activity in a public information campaign. But they also have been growing their maritime capacity, their coast guard. And so they're starting to push back more aggressively, more confidently on the maritime militia and also against the Chinese Coast Guard. That's what we saw flare up most recently in Second Thomas Shoal, where one of the Filipino sailors lost a finger. But what's happening now is the Coast Guard is starting to take a more aggressive, more direct, and so is the Chinese Navy. And so, in my mind, those countries need to continue investing and growing their Coast Guards, but they're going to have to be ready for more directly contesting Chinese vessels. This is one of the reasons why the Chinese Coast Guard vessels are so big. Many of them are repurposed naval vessels, but they're huge. So if you're going to try and push one out of the way, you have to have stronger engines and a bigger displacement.
Mm. It's interesting that the incident at the Second Thomas Shoal you're talking about, with the Chinese troops basically attacked with knives and spears and an axe, that instead of intimidating the Philippines, kind of galvanized the Philippine public. But these other countries, you just sort of brought up Indonesia, and I think you said Vietnam. These are also South China Sea countries that are having their territories, or at least let's say exclusive economic zones, infringed upon by China's Nine Dash Line and its island claims. Are they also potential? What is their status in terms of their Coast Guard and their sort of willingness to engage in a war with China? And I assume they'd be allied with Taiwan, but I mean, I don't know with Vietnam.
Um, I'll start the Philippines. I think increasingly because they're treaty ally with the United States, much like Japan, they saw that if China got into a war over Taiwan, that the United States, their number one security guarantor, is going to get involved in a war. And if their security guarantor loses or is severely hurt, injured in that fight, then they're very vulnerable, and their national security now is at risk. And so Japan said, hey, a fight over Taiwan directly impacts us. We're going to go all in with the United States. In so many words, I'm very simplifying it down. The Philippines under President Marcos now, I think, is in the same place. With the deal was signed in 2014, but it's just now maturing for 10 basing sites to try to attract more U.S. military presence in the Philippines. So the Philippines is going to become a platform. They don't have the capacity to fight directly, but to be a platform from which to go and complicate the Chinese war effort. So those two, I think, would be all in as best they can. But Vietnam, I don't see them coming to side with us directly. But at the same time, there's no love lost between Hanoi and Beijing. They've been building up their naval forces for some time. I think they would probably be in a passive support role and watching to see how things unfold. Maybe later, if the war is favorable to the United States, they might try and attack the Chinese and opportunistically push them out of the Paracels. These are the islands just south of Hainan Island, which they took from Vietnam in 1974. Malaysia, I think, will largely stay out of it. They're very far from where the fighting would be. Indonesia is the same way, and Natuna Island. They're pretty far away from where the fighting would actually occur. So their territorial and their economic interest internally probably won't be a direct threat. So I could see them sitting on the side, but I also don't see them preventing U.S. overflight of forces or even allowing forces to pass through their country like a port visit either. So they would be on side neutral, like,
Right, but they also control the Malacca Strait.
yes.
So, I mean, surely both sides would be trying to get whether it's military or supply vessels through there. And then which side Malaysia and Indonesia come down on is critically important.
It will be. There is no Montreux Treaty in Asia Pacific, so the straits there, the Malacca Straits, as it starts to neck down around Singapore, you've got Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia that all kind of have. I mean, it's their waters. That's international transit route, so there's a lot of opportunity for things to go sideways for the Chinese or even for us through those waters. But I don't see those three countries agreeing to shut that waterway to anyone. The other thing is Indonesia has the Sunda Strait, and there's actually a couple other straits where shipping can bypass the Straits of Malacca. They wouldn't shut those either to anyone's transit. So there's ways around the Malacca Straits. It would be an inconvenience. It does focus in naval forces and commercial shipping that China would still rely on to an extent. But again, this is where a long war goes to probably US advantages because eventually, the longer this war goes on, the Chinese are going to need to have access for energy overseas. But those pressures won't come to bear for like a year into the fighting.
Hmm. Okay, so you had asked earlier a question about the Coast Guard, and Bren, you talked about the Chinese Coast Guard around the Scarborough Shoal, and more recently around the Second Thomas Shoal, which is controlled by the Philippines. And but what about the U.S. Coast Guard? Because I think of U.S. Coast Guard as being like guarding the U.S. coast, but they do a little bit more than that.
Yeah, there had been some arguments, and I'm not in favor of the U.S. Coast Guard going and mixing it up with the Chinese and other people's EEZs. But the U.S. Coast Guard sends a cutter out about once a year out to the Western Pacific, and they go do training missions. Say they go train with the Malaysian MMEA, which is their Coast Guard, or the Philippines or the Japanese Coast Guard. It's a great time to share experience and to gain knowledge from what others are seeing and experiencing with the Chinese forces so that we can be smarter. So we benefit by sending that Coast Guard vessel out there. Those Coast Guards benefit by also getting from our experience and capabilities. That's where that deployment. Our Coast Guard, however, is not equipped to police our own EEZs, which are highly vulnerable in the South and Central Pacific. And Chinese fishing fleets are already marauding through across the Pacific right now. So we're very close to a political embarrassment that could raise this to a top tier national issue if a Chinese fishing fleet decides to do what they did in 2021 around Galapagos Islands. They do that around, say, Johnston Atoll or Wake Island or, heaven forbid, Guam, and the Coast Guard's unable to dissuade them or to get them to vacate from U.S. waters.